Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. I want to welcome our Evolving to Exceptional listeners back to another episode of the podcast. This week, we have a fantastic guest, Keri Smith, who's here with us. She's the Senior Vice President of HR, and she has a rich history in this space that I think is going to bring us a lot of perspective. But most importantly, what I'm really excited to get into is talking about what they have done with really replacing traditional approaches to performance management and reinventing that, and not in a hypothetical way, but in a very concrete way, and taking those steps. And then looking at through the lens of all the things that we can do in the space of people and performance. How do we choose? How do we decide where we invest our time and focus and give attention to, and where are there synergies where we can accomplish maybe more than one thing at a time in a particular space by tackling things in a certain way? And I think performance is a really great example of that. So before we get into all of that, Keri, tell our listeners a little bit about you, about your story, your background. You don't have to give like your full resume, but like who you are and why you do what you do.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to be here. Love talking about all things HR and particularly performance management. So a little bit about me is, I have always loved that learning and growth and education component. I've also liked an element of psychology. So when I went off to school, that's what I really thought that I was going to do. And just life and family circumstances, I was like, this probably isn't going to be the best path, whether it be for money, schooling, all of that. And I was like, I'm good at math. I'll do finance and statistics. So did a complete 180 and started going down that path and got connected after school at Missouri State, so go Bears, of working for the Federal Reserve, and started out in St. Louis and then moved to Richmond, Virginia, and was a consumer compliance examiner for them and got the opportunity within the Federal Reserve System to start teaching and fell back in love with this concept of teaching. And again, through really good conversations with a really good leader, shared that, hey, HR does this, right? I may be interested if anything comes about. So very lucky and blessed that they offered a rotational opportunity, that I had the support of my leader at the time. I got to go to HR for a few months, and then they had an opportunity for an open position. So they took a little bit of a chance on me with really being a bank examiner by trade, but just had a passion for this idea of learning and development. So made the move for what most people, again, really thought was a 180 to the HR space, and got in there and absolutely loved it. So ended up working for the Federal Reserve for 20 years, and almost half of that was in the HR space of some sort. And then decided that I really thought there was an opportunity to get outside the walls of quasi-government and see what else was out there, and had this opportunity to come to my current company in that organizational development space. And they weren't doing a lot in that space. So it was a little bit of a blank page that we started down this path. And performance management was one of those big ones a couple of years into my stint with them, that we started taking a look at potentially, could we do this different? So, and I've been with HHHunt for the last 10 years. Love it. I think they're a fantastic company. And we're in that real estate development and property management space in the Mid-Atlantic. I also got the opportunity to continue working for them, even though I moved back to St. Louis, which is my hometown. And I go back to the East Coast quite a bit to stay connected to everybody, and just absolutely love what we get to do and who I get to do it with. So
I love it.
That's me.
You've got such a diversity, I think, of experience and perspective to bring. And I think what you guys have done, and I want you to maybe tell our listeners a little bit about what it is you've done with performance. and the approach you've taken, and maybe just give a little bit of background about how you've structured that and how that's come about.
Absolutely. So when I joined in 2015, they had really done an overhaul of our mission, vision, and they crafted our values and our brand promises. And part of what they were trying to do was really like what we all try and do is how do we live those values and brand promises? How do we bake it? And it's not just words on a wall or on a piece of paper or anything. And one of our first brand promise is employee centered. And so that's a level of investing in our people and providing an environment that promotes what we want as a company. And we took a step back and said, okay, within the HR space, what are we doing that aligns with those things? And it came pretty obvious that the whole performance management process probably didn't align with what we were trying to do and reflect our values and brand promises. So, and with that, our history in performance management was very similar to the traditional way that most everybody else was taking a stab at performance management: annual reviews, ratings, self-assessments, forms, connection to annual increases, those kind of things. And so we took probably about 18 months, 12 to 18 months to really step back and say, okay, what is our goal with performance management? And what's working, what doesn't work with that goal? What is everybody else doing in this space? And at the end of the day, what can we build that drives performance, aligns with our culture, and is different at the end of the day? And that's moving us towards a different look at performance. And so through all kinds of things, talking with every level within the organization, doing our research, building, unbuilding, and building again, we ended up with a program that we call See Me. And one of the big drivers for us breaking this apart and building something was, at the end of the day, we want to have meaningful, valuable conversations between team members and their manager. We all know the angst that comes along with a lot of performance conversations. So how do we build something? And where we landed was with See Me. And so what See Me is the letter C and then the word me. And so how do we turn this around to say, you as a team member, we want to make sure what you're doing in your role is being beneficial for you and it's being beneficial for us. And we built 5 questions around 5 C words. And there is alignment within all of these to our values and our brand promises. We were going to have these See Me check-in conversations 4 times a year. There was no system to capture it. We provided resources and tools to help facilitate it, but we empowered the team member and the manager to come together, to be prepared, talk about these 5 questions in a way that worked for them. And we didn't require anything else for them to be turned into HR, formal documentation to be turned into anybody. And we disconnected it from the annual increase process. So we were like, just talk to your people. The 5 C questions are around collaboration, around connection, which collaboration is one of our values. Connection was about what people are proud of. And we have passion as one of our values. Any challenges, any coaching. So an opportunity for development and feedback, and then commitment. What did each person need going forward? And since we were doing them about every 3 months, we didn't have a formal timeline, but that you were only really looking back 3 months. And we built into the questions and the resources, try and look forward 3 months. So you were using what you've learned to the success of what was in front of us. So that's where we started in about 2017 is breaking and stopping all things old with performance management and moving into the See Me space.
I have so many questions, but I want to start with, as you were going through the process to make this shift, what were some of the challenges or issues that were problematic about the past approach that drove you to make such a significant shift in terms of the direction and the way in which you were applying performance practices?
Yeah. There's probably two or three big ones. The first one was, well, we were about 48 years old. We were pretty siloed. And so a lot of the different business areas had a different version of performance management. So we had various different forms. Some did self-assessments with the team member, some didn't. We had rating systems that were very different. So that inconsistency, when one of our new approaches was one company, one vision. So how do we bring together in this process something that works for everybody and not these individual approaches? That was something that we knew needed to be fixed in whatever we were going to roll out to everybody. Again, probably some very familiar things and struggles and challenges is people wouldn't hear anything about their performance until that one time a year conversation. And it made it really hard to correct any behavior. And it felt like it evolved on top of each other to a point where it was bigger than it was at the end of the year. And nobody could facilitate correcting any of that ahead of it. And the assumption that my rating connected to my increase number, when in fact, when you really dug into the timing of things, it didn't align that way. And so we were having some people do their own assessment to have that part of the conversation when in fact that really wasn't getting baked into at least the annual increase process. So a lot of distrust in the process was something that we knew we were going to have to build into anything new. And while people didn't like the old process, that was a challenge for us to do something new because at least they knew it. They were familiar with it. And change in general, particularly anything that's connected to their personal performance and potentially their dollars at the end of the day, that change and that movement on that change was definitely a challenge and a struggle for everybody.
So I think you said something interesting there about the challenge with people getting any type of feedback. And I think we often talk about, and it's pretty well discussed, the negatives around performance reviews with ratings and the impact that has. And you just spoke to some of that. But also the studies have shown that it's better to get negative feedback than no feedback, that at least as it correlates to engagement scores, that we do better when we're at least getting some feedback than no feedback, even if it's critical or it's negative. And I think an interesting thing to note about this is that I think we often overlook the resistance that leaders have to giving feedback or having those conversations, either because they themselves have had negative conversations and they don't want to be that person, because they are uncomfortable with how to have it in a conscious, kind, and coherent way, or because they are so focused on execution that they can't stop long enough. They're in such a state of survival and executing and getting things done that they don't step back long enough to take in that bigger picture and to recognize how those conversations can actually create better results, momentum, and impact for everybody involved.
Yes, absolutely. So we jokingly say, just talk to your people. Like there's an element of, if people know, to your point, whether something's going slightly left and when they are doing well, that they just want to know that conversation. And if left to their own accord, they're going to create their own story. And it may not be the right story about what they're doing. And so this idea of if you talk to them 4 times a year, you're in a more proactive space to get in front of some things that, one, may not be going the direction, may not be necessarily negative or positive, but it's going in the direction that both people are on the same page with things. We have worked on either the conflict avoidance of some of these questions and approaches to performance since the moment we rolled this out, because to your point, whether it's their own experiences with this type of stuff, their own preferences in how to talk through these things, we are still, from the top of the leadership down to all of our team members, the concept of feedback and moving us into more of a feedback type culture has been slow, but it's been consistent. Like, we understand that's a discussion topic that unless you do it repeatedly, it feels uncomfortable a lot of the times. So hopefully with the 4 times a year that they're having some sort of performance conversation, that helps get their feet wet and a little bit more comfortable with having the conversations. We have utilized over the last few years a feedback model from the assessment company Insights Discovery that we use that a lot. It's language that everybody knows in the company to allow for some of those preferences, to allow for some of that, I'm just in execution mode, like I need to just get things done, and hopefully addressing the more proactive space so that we're not in a reactive space of somebody getting to a point where they haven't had the feedback. And now we're in an improvement type of space with that individual when potentially we could have headed off a little bit more on the front end.
Well, and I think what's interesting from like a neuroscience perspective is our brain has 2 states. There's a task positive state, which is when we're in execution, when we're getting things done, we're doing tasks. And then there's a default mode network, which is all the rest of the time. And if you think about when we often think like, oh, we suddenly solved the problem, or we had this great insight when we're taking a shower or taking a walk, or that's because our brain goes into default mode. And in default mode, it makes connections that it can't make when it's in task positive. And one of the other things that I think is important around this topic is that we only build relationship connection when we're in a default mode network. So even when we're having conversations about the work that we're getting done, about executing it and who's doing what, we're not really building relationship. We're not building resonance, not building rhythm. We're not attuning to one another. In order to do that, we have to be present and in this default mode movement. And so I think what's interesting, and I want to hear a little bit about that feedback model, is that so often we're so focused on what it is we're going to say and how we're going to say it that we're not present enough in the conversation to actually be in that default mode network in a way that attunes to, creates relationship, creates meaningful connection to the other person. That is actually what's necessary to create change or to create growth in the relationship, in their performance, in the outcome of whatever comes out of it. And so I'm curious a little bit, maybe if you want to share a little bit of what is that feedback approach that allows that to take place.
I love listening to that stuff and learning more about how the brain operates because it's fascinating because we're in the business of people anyway. So that really is the essence without those words of what we really wanted out of See Me. And that's what it was. It was like, see me as a human, make that connection with me and do it in this context. And there's no ratings. There's no tie to it is designed to build that relationship. The feedback model that we use from Insight, because it organizes preferences in colors. So very similar to a Myers-Briggs, it uses a lot of that research and data behind Myers-Briggs, but it just does it in colors. The feedback model is designed to say, okay, you have all 4 colors, you have a preference. But in this kind of context, we really want you to hit on all 4 of those. So it doesn't necessarily just fit your preferences, but you're being able to connect and adapt potentially to what the other person is. So it starts out with basically step 1 is talk about the details, like talk about the situation in a more factual standpoint. And then step 2 is coming into, and really step 1 is about that thinking preference that's from Myers-Briggs. The black and white, the factual things. Step 2 moves into a green space where the green space is about the building the relationships, that one-on-one connection. And it's talking about how somebody interpreted what those facts were. What meaning did they give it? What feelings or emotions did they have around it? And then moving into step 3 is this sort of inclusive conversation about, okay, let's talk about how that happened. And is this something, how do we not do that? If it's something negative or constructive, how do we do that differently going forward. So it's this inclusive, we're in this together conversation. And then the red energy is the step 4, which is, okay, so we're agreeing to, this is the action we're going to take going forward and how we're going to connect on it at a later date. So it's supposed to take you around and balance out that very thinking preference in decision-making and information with that feeling preference also of, what are some of the subjective things? Because what we've learned in just dealing with any sort of issue that a team member or a manager might have is that interpretation and meaning and feelings behind stuff is what kind of gets in the way or grows when evaluating performance and that history. So we tend to look back on our experiences to figure out what do we believe and perceive this person to do or be, and we take action on that. So not talking about those interpretations and meanings and feelings is a little bit of a gap and can get us into some other issues if we don't tackle that. And so we put those two things together when we talk about the feedback, and we just did this with some leaders, like that's the model from a process standpoint in these conversations. We also talk about SCARF and a little bit of that neuroscience of, remember, there's a person sitting across from you, a human, and being mindful of just some of the natural things that the brain is going to want to trigger as either a threat, a reward, and being mindful of both of those things as you go into this type of conversation.
Well, and I think what's one thing that's really commendable that I think probably supports all of this is the separation of the compensation and the rating piece, right? And by separating those, anytime compensation is tied into reviews, right, you're going to trigger survival responses because compensation is so key to our ability to survive, to have a job. And reviews tap into that same energy, right? Like, is this going to hurt me? Am I going to have a job? How's it impacting my ability to be promoted or progress in terms of my career?
Absolutely.
All of that triggers those like survival responses of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And I think we have to be really cognizant for leaders of holding all of that, right? Like, we're going to hold all these steps and all these components, and navigating a conversation can be really challenging. It can be a lot. And so the only way to get good at it is with a lot of practice. And so I love that you're like, just talk to people and eliminating some of the stigma too, that there's one right way. And so one of the things I always tell leaders too is to trust your own intuition. So not a survival response, but to trust your own sense of what's important. And the only way you can actually connect with that sense of what's important is if you're really present and in your body and in the moment. So those are, to me, some of the most foundational things that sometimes leaders miss, is that they're thinking about it as a task list of what are the things I have to check off, rather than coming in really present with what does this person need right now in this conversation, in this moment.
Yeah. And one of the challenges when we moved into this CME space is we went, whether they liked it or not, a very structured, formal program on how to evaluate performance, what it was connected to, and those kind of things. When we launched CME, it was almost the exact opposite. It was very open, very gray, not formal in its structure and everything. And I think that shift presented those opportunities of, wow, like I don't have to follow just A through Z to do this. Like, I've got some questions, but there's openness to how I can approach these conversations and talk through it. We eventually got to a point where a few years ago, well, probably, in 2023, where both team members and leaders were like, we need some sort of assessment in how we talk to people about where their performance is. So we went down a path of how do we stay true to the overall philosophy that our approach to performance is our success is based on the growth and development of our people. That's something that has been baked into our culture for a number of years, that having the most talented, trained individuals is one of our biggest assets and one of our biggest drivers that we're going to stay committed to. So learning and development has always been at the heart of our culture. And so how do we create something that doesn't take us back into that space of there's a rating, there's a number, it equals X number of dollars. And so we spent some time, we worked with a lot of leaders. We did a couple of versions of this, got some great feedback, and we ended up in a space of what we call our contribution assessment tool. We've baked that into the process of See.Me. So now there's 2 See.Me conversations a year and 2 CAT conversations a year. And the CAT conversations are really about, okay, let's just see where we are. There is an assessment piece to it on 4 questions, but we honed in on really that learning and development piece of people and their jobs. And we honed in on the building of the relationships and communication in doing those. They don't get an overall assessment rating. We use words instead of numbers. And while it is data that the leaders can look at from an annual increase perspective, there is no metric or attachment that this word or this number that you put with the word equals anything. It is just another data point that the leader has in addition to various other data points in deciding what they want to do from an annual increase perspective. So that's been a little bit of a challenge because I think when people saw that, they were like, oh, well, then if I am aligned, then that must equal an X percentage. And that's not the case. We are trying to empower the leaders to use that as, again, another input when they're looking at all the data that they've got regarding their teams and how they want to approach rewarding people from a performance standpoint.
I think it's really interesting in how those 2 are very distinctly separate so that they're not convoluted or confused as being necessarily the same thing.